I'm going to move to the next chart, which is called the monetary base. And this is the one problem I haven't covered, and I want to spend a few minutes on that. In this chart on the monetary base, it's going to show you what is happening to our country. This is the amount of money that we are creating out of thin air. Now, they call it printing money. It is printing money in a way, and it isn't in another way. And let me explain that to you. This is the largest increase in money that we have had since the Federal Reserve started in 100 years. This is unprecedented, and we have no precedent other than Japan to see what would happen when a nation does this. This is my biggest single fear. Of all the problems we talked about, they pale compared to this. Because if the Federal Reserve does not handle this properly, we're going back to 7.5 to 8 times multiples, and that's a long ways down from here. Fortunately, we're going to have a few years to be able to warn us of that because of the fact that with the unemployment today, with the slack in the economy, with the wages not increasing, we can't have long-term inflation, but we can have it over the long run if we don't pull this money out. I remember when I first started in the business, I was studying all the currencies and the gold markets and all these things, and I was listening to a man who was at that time the world-renowned currency expert. His name was Franz Pick. He was an incredible guy. He had studied 509 currencies. He showed you the history of each one of them, and he said in that Austrian accent, most of them are toilet paper. And the reason was because their Federal Reserve would just continue to print them. Now, America at that time was still tied to gold. We had a gold exchange standard. 25% of our money supply was tied to the price of gold, so they couldn't print. But what did Nixon do? Nixon got together and eliminated the gold backing of the American dollar. It's being fiat currency at that time. And Franz Pick, 35 years ago, said, America cannot go longer. I have never seen any nation go more than 35 years in a fiat currency. There's always going to be somebody that comes along and prints more than they should. And so when he did that, he had a seminar. I couldn't afford to go to that seminar at the time, but I got his tapes. And it was the funniest thing he ever said. He had all these people in the seminar, and he said, here you are, all of you Americans. They're printing money. They severed the price of gold, and you're just sitting here smiling. He says, I can't understand it. He said, why don't you take these people, put them against the wall, and shoot them? Now, that was his explanation of what happens when people print money. And as I see this chart, I'm hearing these words ringing in the back of my ears about what Franz Pick would think about it. Now, there's only one thing I can say about this that could be the salvation of this. This money is not going into the economy. If it was going into the economy, we would already have huge inflation. Where it's going into the banks. Now, why is it going into the banks? Well, the banks are getting 0.25% for not doing anything, so they get this money. It's the Fed deposits in the bank. They move it over to the Fed. Fed gives them 0.25% for nothing. They don't need to make any loans. They're making money off the money that the Fed is printing. So they're going to be very content to leave that money in the bank. And as long as they leave it in the bank, it's not going to cause a lot of inflation. However, what happens is that what the Fed, I believe, is doing is they're keeping it in the bank so the banks can earn profits because they got a lot of bad loans they got to write off. And as they make more profits, they can write off these loans. And then hopefully, when that process is done and the healing is done, the Fed pulls it back out. And now let's turn to the Japanese experience. And you can see that that actually has been done. So my great hope is that the United States Treasury will at some point wake up and realize that they can't do this forever, and I'm sure they're more aware of it than all of us are. They'll pull it back out. Now look at the Japanese experience. When they hit their bubble in '89, they printed money like nobody has ever done. 8.2 times the monetary base. We're only at 3.1. I'm not minimizing it, but I'm just showing relative. Now, after a while, they pulled it back out. 2 years later, they pulled it back out. They're starting it again. But take a look at the next chart. Their inflation is almost zero. So there is a precedent for what Bernanke is doing, is that creating this money, resalvaging the banks, making them develop their balance sheets, picking up that, and then being able to pull it back out. So if they pull it back out, then I believe we can get by without serious inflation. Here is the worry. What if somebody gets in office and it becomes a big political pressure and they don't want to go through a recession because as you pull it back out, you're slowing things down and you could tip the nation in a recession. So there's a lot of ifs and ohs that could happen, but I would say that a responsible Fed, and all of the people that I've read on the Fed are pretty responsible people. I am not critical of Mr. Bernanke. I think he's got one of the toughest jobs in the world. There is nobody that is under more pressure than this gentleman. He's done a very good job of doing what he's doing. I'm not agreeing with it, but I would not be able to run the Federal Reserve, so I think he is the right man for the job at the time, although what he is doing is a very big and bold gamble. But when you consider the alternatives, he may not have any choice. So now we're going to leave these problems, and we're going to move into the next section, because I believe that I've demonstrated that if we do the calculations on our stock, if we build up cash when the market gets into the higher zones, we'll be able to protect the portfolios, not in any 1 week or 1% at a time, but over the long run. Right now, the risk and reward on our portfolios, if we were to clock it out, is 29%. We are 29% away from our worst case. Our upside is about 65%. So we have a lot of room on the upside, but we can't ignore the downside either.